Video games are unique as an artistic medium. Not only do they allow the consumer to interact with a much wider possibility space than other mediums, but they also allow the consumer to directly influence the art itself. The stories, experiences, messages, and meaning that are conveyed are not only subject to the interpretation of the consumer, but they can be directly influenced or changed by the consumer's actions and choices. In some cases, a game can even prey upon the expectations of the player, or the player's desire to complete the game in order to convey a particular message, or to make a statement about the player's actions. One classic example of a game that plays the player as much as the player plays it is Silent Hill 2. That game's endings and the triggers for each ending have always been one of my favorite design aspects of that game. Silent Hill 2 takes advantage of the player's preconceived notions about how a horror game should be played, and it uses your play to pivot James's resolution and his very character in one of several directions. I'm going to be talking about Silent Hill 2's endings. It should go without saying that this post will include major spoilers for Silent Hill 2. I will also be comparing Silent Hill 2 to other games such as Mass Effect, Fallout, The Witcher 3, The Last of Us, and What Remains of Edith Finch. And I will also be comparing it to the post-Team Silent Hill games, Silent Hill Homecoming, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, and Silent Hill Downpour. So there will also be varying degrees of spoilers for those games as well. Consider yourself warned.
No. It's not true. That's impossible!
Silent Hill 2's endings are not obvious, explicit choices that the game prompts you with, like the Paragon or Renegade options that you might see in Mass Effect. Nor are they even the result of navigating less ham-fisted dialogue trees like what you might see in classic Fallout games or more recent example like The Witcher 3. In all of those cases, the games are giving the player explicit choices and prompts, and the player expects that these choices will affect the resolution of the given quest, how the storyline will branch, the ending that will be achieved, or any combination thereof. Add up enough Paragon points, and Commander Shepard will have access to more diplomatic options for nobly and heroically saving the galaxy. Be nice to all the right people in The Witcher 3 and help them with their personal crusades, and they'll join you for the climatic battle against the Wild Hunt. Do lots of side quests and help out the citizens of Fallout's wasteland, and the ending vignette will depict positive outcomes for those settlements. The player knows that their choices in these major prompts will shape the story to come, or its resolution, even if the player is ignorant to what exact effects the choices will have. It's very easy for such choices to feel very gamified. I want a, quote, good ending, so I make seemingly good or morally correct choices in these prompts, and I expect to be rewarded accordingly. The best that such games can do is to hope to blur the line between what is the, quote, right choice and what is a, quote, wrong choice. This is something that The Witcher 3 does exceptionally well, but there are still obvious good and bad choices. These key choices determine which ending the player receives. Silent Hill 2's ending triggers, however, are far more subtle and more insidious. Yes, Silent Hill 2 does provide the player with specific prompts throughout the game. Will you pick up any given item? Will you reach into this slimy hole filled with bugs? Will you pull a mystery obstruction out of a filthy clogged toilet? Will you jump into this seemingly bottomless pit in a surreal inverted prison hallway? But these are all false choices.
Forget it. This is way too gross. Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
You can skip picking up ammo and healing items if you don't want them, but there's really no reason not to. Setting aside one small set-piece occasion, your inventory is never limited, and you have no logistical or capacity reasons to not pick up everything that you come across. a far cry from other survival horror games like Resident Evil. Key items must be picked up in order for you to proceed. You must reach into the slimy hole to find a key to progress the game. You must jump into the bottomless pits to reach the next area of the game. These apparent choices exist only to instill a sense of doubt within the player, a feeling that the action is risky, or that maybe you've missed something important that you might not be able to return to later. Like, say, I don't know, an inconspicuous plastic bottle that you can maybe use to suck up some mysterious red liquid. Silent Hill does not want these sorts of big choices to matter, because Silent Hill 2 doesn't want the player to know that you're making plot-critical decisions. Instead, Silent Hill 2 tracks seemingly innocuous actions and playstyle behaviors that have certain thematic relevance, all without the player's knowledge, and then uses them to pivot James's resolution in one of several ways. It does this because it wants the outcome of the game to be determined by the aggregate sum of lots of seemingly mundane, incidental behaviors, rather than a few specific key decisions. Silent Hill 2 wants the player to roleplay as James, and it assumes that your behavior while playing as James is actually informing James's character. Every moment of gameplay matters to Silent Hill 2, not just the important big decision moments. Not only do you guide James through the personal hell that Silent Hill puts him through, you also slightly define a little bit of who he is. In an exemplar of interactive narrative, the ending you get is determined by how you play the game, and not by a series of choose-your-own-adventure meta branches. You have to roleplay the entire game in order to get a specific outcome. Unlike so many other games in which the player character can say one thing in dialogue or cutscenes, or make a specific choice when prompted,
War is where the young and stupid are tricked by the old and bitter into killing each other. I was very young and very angry. Maybe that is no excuse.
While the player behaves entirely different in actual gameplay, the outcome that you get in Silent Hill 2 is shaped by how you play. More so than many of its peers, Silent Hill 2 uses the interactivity of the entire game to influence a non-interactive ending. Without knowing that you were choosing an ending, you effectively chose the ending of the game by how you treated James, and how you made James treat the other characters, including the memory of his wife Mary. Compare this to games that have static endings, like The Last of Us. The Last of Us is a very good game, with a high-quality, well-told story. In the cutscenes, anyway. Because The Last of Us doesn't really tell much of its story with the actual gameplay. Nor does the player's play actually influence how the story unfolds or is resolved. In fact, despite The Last of Us being about the surrogate father-daughter relationship between Joel and Ellie, Ellie is rarely ever an active element of gameplay. She is invisible to the enemies during stealth, and can completely fend for herself in combat. Aside from a handful of navigational puzzles, you can completely ignore Ellie during gameplay, but your lack of concern will never transfer to the character of Joel, nor will Ellie ever resent Joel for your neglect. Joel will always go on his climactic murder spree at the Firefly Hospital in order to rescue Ellie and potentially damn the entire human race, in stark contrast to what Ellie, or you, the player, probably would have actually wanted. Now, don't get me wrong, that does not mean that The Last of Us is a bad game, or that it has a bad story, or even that I think that it has a bad ending. In fact, the lack of player agency in the conclusion represents the fact that Joel is a slave to his own guilt, and by extension, the player, who is controlling Joel, is a slave to Joel's guilt as well. Joel failed to save Sarah, and since he has projected his love for Sarah onto Ellie, he cannot let himself fail to save her. So the player has no choice in the matter. It's a well-told story, and the shift in perspective for the final scene, in which the player plays as Ellie, reframes Joel as villainously selfish and dishonest. Now compare this to a game like What Remains of Edith Finch. That game also has a set, heavily scripted narrative. You play on a track in which all the outcomes are predetermined, and your actions have no influence on the outcome of the game, at least not that I'm aware of. You will experience every vignette in pretty much the exact same way as any other player. However, the playable nature of these vignettes creates a dramatic irony for the player that would be mostly lost if the game were adapted into a movie. You know your actions are going to inadvertently cause a tragedy, but despite having control over the action, you can't stop it from happening, short of turning off the game and not playing. This begs the question of what responsibility you, the player, have regarding the outcome of each vignette. Are these tragedies the result of players' negligence, or are they a simple matter of predestination?
But he said Lewis had become a model employee.
Silent Hill 2 makes for a good contrast with both The Last of Us and What Remains of Edith Finch, because all three of these games are about a character's sense of guilt, and how that character copes with that guilt. Silent Hill 2, however, is the only game of the three that even remotely cares about what you, the player, do while you're playing the game. A Hollywood writer could definitely boil Silent Hill 2's plot down to a single, non-interactive movie script and tell the same basic story, since the details of that story do not change based on the ending. But please don't. Silent Hill 2's endings add thematic weight and consequence to many of the minor interactions that the player has over the course of the game. It's something that you likely won't come to realize or appreciate until a repeat playthrough, but no movie script is likely to ever be able to replicate that. The player's actions are effectively foreshadowing the conclusion. No one ending is the true ending of Silent Hill 2. None is more valid than the others. Therefore, no single set of player actions can singularly and comprehensively inform James's character and foreshadow a singular ending. How would a Hollywood writer choose which ending to write? Unlike Joel or Edith, whose stories are both resolved independent of the player, James requires a player to animate him, or else his story remains not only unresolved, but also unresolvable. A movie writer could run into similar problems with trying to adapt something like Mass Effect or Fallout or The Witcher 3, because there are radically different endings. Those games, however, use fairly rigid binary morality systems to determine their endings. We as gamers have already labeled those games as having good endings and bad endings. The good endings tend to be the more desirable ones, because they usually require the most effort or skill to achieve. Beyond that, which ending to choose is basically determined by whether the writer and director would want the movie to feel uplifting or feel morose. Are there good endings and bad endings in Silent Hill 2? Well, for one thing, none of the three default endings really requires any more work from the player than any of the other two. A lot of the internet sources might tell you that the Leave, also called Laura, ending is the good ending. Other sources might insist that the In Water ending is the only canonical ending. I disagree with both of these assertions. To me, Silent Hill 2 has no good ending, let alone a canon ending. All of Silent Hill 2's endings are some shades of gray. So let's look at the actual default endings of Silent Hill 2, how they are triggered, and how each of them interpret the player's actions. I'm not going to talk about any of the secret or unlockable endings because most players just aren't going to see those, and I could actually see a legitimate argument for saying that those aren't canon because you can't earn them on a first playthrough. So let's just focus on the three default endings. The In Water ending is probably my personal favorite ending in the game, not because I think it's the canon ending or the most believable ending or anything like that. Rather, I like it because I think it's the most mechanically engaging and interesting ending. The In Water ending basically sees James become so overcome by his guilt and depression that he drives into the lake and kills himself in order to be with Mary. From a narrative standpoint, this ending means that James doesn't value his own life, and a life without Mary is not a life worth living. Mechanically, this ending is achieved by the player not valuing James's life, and the game uses some clever mechanical trickery and subversion of expectations to nudge players along the path to this ending. The In Water ending is triggered by doing the following. All of these behaviors show the player, and by extension James, to be careless with his life, reckless in his behavior, and dwelling on the thoughts of suicide. This ending sees James accept responsibility for Mary's death, be forgiven by her memory, get over his guilt, and reject the temptation of Maria, all of which are ostensibly good things. However, this ending is widely regarded as the bad ending because James commits suicide. That perception is justifiable. It should always be considered a tragedy when someone succumbs to depression and resorts to ending his or her life. However, I still struggle to think of this ending as the singular bad ending, because the other two endings aren't much happier in the long run. What makes this ending so mechanically interesting is how it exploits established gameplay tropes of the survival horror genre in order to manipulate the player into suicidal behavior. Silent Hill 4, by the way, does a similar thing in order to turn the player into a voyeur and peeping Tom. Classic survival horror games, Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, and the first Silent Hill, were games of resource management. Players had been trained by the predecessors of Silent Hill 2 to covet and conserve their ammunition and healing items, and to not use them frivolously. Don't fire your gun unless you have a clear shot, and don't use a healing item if you're not damaged enough to need its full effects. However, Silent Hill 2 is a surprisingly easy game. Even on the hard action difficulty, the monsters are not particularly dangerous, though a couple of the bosses are definitely a threat. Most combat can be avoided entirely by simply running past the monsters, especially in the wide open streets of the town where James can literally run circles around them. If you do find yourself having to fight, then the game is also very generous with the amount of ammunition that it provides. And if you find yourself taking damage in those fights, the game is similarly generous with healing items. There's plenty of health drinks and first aid kits lying around, and very little reason not to top off your health after taking damage. But doing so goes against the instincts of many players, who are conditioned by games like Resident Evil and the first Silent Hill that healing items are a precious commodity and should be conserved. Save up your green herbs so you can mix them with red or blue herbs. Don't use a first aid kit if a simple health drink will suffice. The psychology at play here is similar to how the original Resident Evil was overly generous with its supply of ink ribbons, but still forced the player to have to think about whether it was worth carrying one around in your inventory, and about whether you were using too many of them. Similarly, the more developed melee combat in the Silent Hill games, compared to Resident Evil, encourages players to actually use the wooden planks and steel pipes, as opposed to the borderline useless waste of an inventory slot that is the combat knife in Resident Evil. The increased usability of the melee weapons, combined with the desire to conserve ammunition for tougher enemies and bosses, provides a perverse incentive for the player to put themselves into harm's way by engaging monsters in melee whenever practical. This can lead to the player taking some cheap shots that you wouldn't suffer if you just used a gun and the game's abundant supply of bullets to take out any enemy from a safe distance. As such, it is not uncommon for a player to run around Silent Hill 2 with at least some damage to James, and to wait until your health status is flashing yellow or red before using a healing item to top it off. If the monsters were too hard, or health items too sparse, then players would constantly be taking damage and wouldn't have the resources available to heal even if they wanted to. In that case, the in-water ending would probably be pretty much guaranteed for most players' first playthroughs, assuming nothing else changes. The player's playstyle, therefore, would hardly factor into the ending, since only very good players would have the skill necessary to not appear suicidally reckless. If the player does not prove James to be hopelessly suicidal, then the other two default endings basically come down to which of James's two muses the player empathizes more with. If the player is overly protective of Maria, then the game will give you the aptly named Maria ending, which is not called Leave, despite the fact that James appears to leave the town with Maria. Any celebration that you might have regarding escaping the town with your sexy, vibrant new girlfriend is quickly squashed by the implication that Maria, being a doppelganger of Mary, is afflicted with the same fatal illness as Mary.
You better do something about that cough.
In order to achieve this ending, you must meet the following conditions. This ending also kind of feels like a bad or evil ending. Here, James forsakes Mary and gives in to selfish desire. James gets over his guilt by justifying Mary's murder under the umbrella of taking his own life back. Mary was dying anyway, and it was better for both of them, but mostly him, to end it. Now he has a hot new girlfriend who is literally custom made for him. Of course, he's still going to be punished for his selfishness, as Maria is also likely to be terminally ill. And it's entirely possible that Maria is going to turn out to be emotionally abusive. So yeah, he isn't dead, but this is still not a good or healthy situation. And that's assuming that he actually does leave the town with Maria, and that he isn't stuck in some kind of Silent Hill purgatory. Heck, given that she's a manifestation created by the power of Silent Hill, it's not even clear to the player whether she would even continue to exist after James leaves the range of influence of that power. Now, mechanically, this ending plays on the player's instinct to protect your escort charge, as well as your sympathy towards a character who appears to be ill. If you've played classic video games, then you should be very familiar with the damsel in distress trope. Wait, if this game goes out of its way to make the player actively dislike Maria, and she is in fact a manipulative villain in 2 out of the 3 endings, does this still count as a damsel in distress trope, or is this a subversion of that trope? I'm not really sure. I'm going to need the community's help with that one. In any case, there's a game over if Maria dies during gameplay, including potentially by the player's own hand. Even though she is killed several times in cutscenes or off camera, you never escort her after that first death. So having seen her die already, and knowing that she can respawn, won't play into how vigilantly you protect her in that first playthrough. Despite feeling pressured to ensure Maria's security, Maria is not presented as a trustworthy or particularly likable character to the player. Like with all the other characters in Silent Hill 2, James's interactions with Maria are subtly off-putting and unnerving. She gives off a sense that she isn't being completely honest with James. Maria is clearly toying with James' emotions. She behaves seductively and teases and titillates James right from the start, but she is also emotionally abusive, even going so far as to gaslight him later in the game. This serves to try to push the player away, but none of that happens until after the player has been forced to protect her during the brief escort segment from Rosewater Park to Brookhaven Hospital. The roleplay element of this ending path is, I would say, undercut slightly by the intrigue regarding who or what Maria might be. Even though the player may not like or sympathize with Maria or want to even protect her, let alone have James hook up with her in the end, I can easily see a player keeping a close eye on Maria and checking up on her in the hospital to make sure that she's not up to any shenanigans. Such a player would then accidentally trip over a lot of the criteria for earning the Maria ending. Maria thus induces a series of conflicting emotional and mechanical responses from the player. Whether it's curiosity or empathy that keeps the player coming back to Maria, this protective action leads James to develop an unhealthy attachment to her.
Come on. Let's get out of here.
What about Mary?
It's okay. I have you.
Conventional wisdom would say that the leave, also called Laura ending, is the, quote, good ending. After all, James comes to terms with his guilt over Mary's death, he defeats the corrupting influence of the Maria doppelganger, and he presumably honors Mary's dying wish of adopting Laura and goes on with his life. James basically atones for his actions and moves on. Laura even gets out of the foster system and has a new home, and they all lived happily ever after. Right. Some will say that Silent Hill 4 makes this ending non-canon since James's father says that his son disappeared, so clearly he can't have left with Laura, right? Of course, if that's true, then only the in-water ending is canon, since James also couldn't have left town with Maria in her ending. Others might counter by suggesting that James never really does leave, and that he's still trapped in the limbo of Silent Hill along with Laura or Maria, even though James has conquered his guilt and the town should no longer have power over him. Of course, it's also possible that the Superintendent Sunderland's statement about his son disappearing in Silent Hill doesn't have to conflict with any of the endings. Perhaps James did return to reality, or whatever you want to call it, but simply left his old life behind, whether with Laura or with Maria. I mean, he did still kill Mary and Eddie, so maybe he thinks he needs to lie low, just like Harry did after the first Silent Hill. The leave ending is kind of the default ending that you get if you don't earn one of the other two. There are still a few assertive things that you can do to push yourself towards this ending or cancel out any incidental points that you may have accrued towards the other endings, but for the most part, the criteria for meeting this ending are don't do the things that trigger the other endings. The full list of leave requirements are: mechanically, the leave ending is opposed to both the In-Water and Maria endings. This ending requires that the player valued James's life during the game and kept him at max health, either by healing shortly after taking damage, or by never having taken the damage to begin with. You can also use the effects of the Ampule, which, as I understand it, temporarily increases James's max HP, something that's very useful if you take damage early in a boss fight and need to heal. This shows that James does indeed value his life, and will fight to protect it, marry or no. You will need to be very dismissive of Maria and resist her attempts to seduce James, and most importantly, you need to dwell on the thoughts of Mary and remain determined to progress the game. Don't look back and try to return to areas you've already been. Always look forward, towards that possible reunion with Mary. Rather than ruminating over Angela's knife, you should instead admire Mary's photo and letter, and maybe even recognize that the letter slowly disappears late in the game.
Me? No. I'd never kill myself.
By honoring Mary's memory, resisting the temptation of Maria, and valuing the preservation of his own life, maybe, just maybe, James can actually move on with his life. Now, assuming that James and Laura actually do leave the town and return to some sort of normal life, is that actually a happy ending? Yeah, this was Mary's last wish, but there's one fundamental problem. James is not Mary. Mary wanted to adopt Laura, not James. Laura is Mary's friend, not James's friend. James does not know Laura, and Laura does not know James. Heck, James and Laura don't even really seem to get along, and neither of them seems to really like each other. This relationship seems doomed before it even begins. Is James going to adopt Laura and spend the rest of his life living with a living, breathing reminder of his loss and of his crime? Is Laura ever going to be able to forgive him for killing Mary? Should she? James tries to rationalize Mary's murder by saying that he did it to end her suffering, but he also confesses that he did it because he wanted his life back. With that in mind, could he even be half of the attentive and supportive surrogate father that Harry turned out to be?
He loved me just like I was his very own daughter. I never had a chance to tell you how happy you made me.
Whether you interpret this ending as good will probably depend on whether you consider all three primary endings to accurately represent James's psyche simultaneously, or if you see one of them as being retroactively true in any given playthrough. Is James as selfish as the Maria ending makes him out to be? Is a life without Mary really as meaningless and empty as the In-Water ending makes it out to be? If either or both of those are still true in the Leave ending, then James and Laura are in for a miserable and toxic life together. There's also the question of whether Laura is healthy. After all, she and Mary met in the same hospital. Why was Laura in the hospital? This is something that I don't think is ever actually addressed in the game. Is she too chronically or terminally ill? Am I just overthinking this? I mean, I guess it's possible that Laura could have been there because her parents were sick and dying. In which case, did Laura also just recently lose her parents? Ugh, what a quagmire. Heck, some would even argue that Laura isn't even real, that she is also a manifestation just like Maria, the daughter that Mary wanted but could never have. I personally don't buy into that idea, but if you do, then that opens up a whole other rabbit hole of whether James actually does or can leave with her, or if he's trapped in limbo like Rose and Sharon are in the movie.
What's that letter?
None of your business.
What separates Silent Hill 2 from its myriad copycats, including Silent Hill Origins, Homecoming, Shattered Memories, and Downpour, is that these divergent endings do not alter or retcon the underlying story or drama. The nature of James's crime and his guilt remains consistent regardless of which ending the player triggers. It is only how James resolves that guilt that changes. Compare this to Homecoming, Shattered Memories, and Downpour, which dramatically change the nature of the protagonist and thus the entire narrative of the game, depending on which ending the player achieves. The game's story leading up to that ending has to remain ambiguous and non-committal, which can turn that story into nonsensical gibberish. Homecoming is probably the most blatant ripoff of Silent Hill 2. The main character, Alex, travels to Silent Hill to confront the guilt he feels over having accidentally killed his younger brother, a memory that he has apparently repressed. If the player demonstrates callous indifference to the other players, then the game will give you one of the worst endings, in which Alex is presented as a killer or literal monster by becoming a Pyramid Head ripoff called the Bogeyman. This approach mirrors Silent Hill 2 on the surface, but it misses much of the nuance and cleverness that was present in Silent Hill 2. How Alex treats other characters is determined by explicit choices presented by button prompts or dialogue options. It isn't the player's subtle behavioral nuances throughout the game that determine how Alex's story is resolved. It's your response to contrived and obvious prompts. To make matters worse, these bad endings muddy the narrative. If it turns out that Alex was in fact the patient in room 206 all along, then was Joshua ever even real? In Homecoming's own in-water ending, it turns out that Alex had been sacrificed and that Joshua gets to carry on the family legacy. In both of these cases, the events of the game never actually happened, and Alex may not harbor any guilt for a crime that he didn't commit. Then there's Shattered Memories' bastardization of Harry Mason's character. This game sets itself up as a remake or reboot of the original game, starting with the same setup, but it turns into a sort of what-if sequel to the first game's worst ending. Harry died in the car crash in the original Silent Hill. That game's events never happened, nor apparently any of the sequels, and now a teenaged Cheryl is undergoing therapy to cure her delusion that Harry is still trapped in a haunted Silent Hill looking for her. I'll give Climax credit. That is actually a fairly clever idea, and the twist is executed well enough. Sadly, the rest of the game isn't nearly as clever. This game advertises itself as profiling the player as you play, and tailoring the horror and endings based on how you play. It does this in the most lazy and superficial levels. Shattered Memories doesn't fall into the trap of putting explicit button prompts on the screen to determine the game's outcomes, but all of the choices that it gives the player are explicit branches in the game's progression, such as choosing which of 2 stores to enter when looking for Cheryl. These branches have virtually no effect on the plot, however, as they are self-contained set pieces that, like a quantum superposition, collapse back into the same otherworld chase sequences and cutscenes. The only things that change are some superficial elements of character and monster design. Like with Homecoming, the greater offense is how the various endings completely change the story and completely change who Harry Mason is. In some cases, he can turn out to be a decent man, comparable to the original Harry Mason. If you look at too many pinup calendars,
Nice.
he becomes a raving sexaholic. If you look at too many beer cans, he becomes a raving alcoholic. In cases like this, he's not even worth being fondly remembered by Cheryl, though the game may or may not account for this. These endings retroactively change who Harry is, and they punish the player for trying to explore the environments and see every nook and cranny, because beer cans and pinup posters are going to be hidden in those nooks and crannies. If you're too busy exploring the environments to even bother looking for Cheryl, then maybe you probably deserve for her to recognize you for the neglectful father that you are. So, I don't know, maybe Shattered Memories is more clever than I've given it credit for. Overall, this execution comes closest to Silent Hill 2, but I've always felt that it's much more ham-fisted. Downpour might perhaps be the worst offender when it comes to poorly written endings. This game goes out of its way to keep everything as vague as possible, yet its endings still manage to feel mutually exclusive, and they conflict with the larger story being told. The endings of Downpour are mechanically similar to Homecoming, in which the player chooses one of two explicit prompts at several points throughout the prompt. Again, these choices have absolutely no impact on the story as it progresses, and the game even seems to actively ignore any attempts you make to try to be helpful or benevolent. Like the other two games, the various endings completely change the context of the story. In some cases, they make it so that the game never even took place. In another case, the roles of Murphy and Anne are reversed, which opens up questions of whether the events of the game ever happened, who killed who, and who was chasing who. In two cases, however, the ending completely invalidates the entire point of the game to begin with, and possibly the point of the entire series. Downpour sets Silent Hill up as a town in which the guilty are perpetually punished until they come to terms with their sins and atone for their actions. This is a rabbit hole that could probably deserve its own analysis video, but we'll have to get to that later. In one ending, Murphy turns out to have murdered his son, in which case he didn't need to seek revenge against Napier, and he doesn't have any guilt or remorse. And all that lip service that the game pays to Murphy needing to come to terms with what he's done just stops making sense. In another ending, it turns out that Murphy didn't kill Napier, and also did not harm Officer Coleridge, in which case Silent Purgatory is punishing him for a crime that he did not commit. Does he feel guilty for his involvement? Yeah, sure, maybe. Does that warrant the abuse that the town puts him through? Absolutely not. In either case, the game should have ended when Anne confronts Murphy in the mines and finds the police badge in his pocket, and this is like an hour into the game. Murphy is never presented as having amnesia, so he knows that he's either a cop killer or that he was framed as being a cop killer, depending retroactively on which ending you end up getting. Or Murphy is a cop, but Anne is a cop killer. Damn it, Downpour. Ugh. There is no context in which Murphy's line,
I don't know who you think I am, or what you think I've done,
makes any sense. Even if he didn't commit the crime, he knows what he was framed for. Was there some point in the game's development in which it was possible to achieve an ending in which Murphy had no involvement or knowledge of Coleridge's death at all? That is the only context in which this line makes sense. If such an ending was removed, then why was this line left in the game? Ugh, such a mess.
No, I'm done. I'm finished with the riddles, the mind games. Whatever I did to get here, I've had enough. I want out. Do you understand me? Do ya?
Son, you still don't get it. It doesn't matter what you want. As for me, I got mail to deliver. Goodbye, Murphy.
Anyway, the point of all this is that there is no ending for Silent Hill 2 in which James turns out to be innocent of Mary's death, or in which it turns out that nothing in the game ever actually happened, or that James was secretly Pyramid Head all along, or that Maria killed Mary to be with James and Pyramid Head is trying to keep them apart, or any similarly lazy, stupid, or cop-out ending. Because of that, James's character is consistent right up until the final boss fight, and the entire game is tightly designed with symbolism and foreshadowing. Downpour, Shattered Memories, and Homecoming have to leave their plot and lore non-committal, confusing, and sometimes flat-out contradictory because they have to support so many contradictory endings right from the start of the game without knowing which ending you're going to get. They cannot be tightly designed because any symbols or foreshadowing that the game might try doing are moot or negated by one or more endings. This leaves the games full of seemingly meaningless plot threads and glaring plot holes. Silent Hill 2 stands tall and proud as a work of interactive literature. All of its parts come together into a near flawless masterpiece that took full advantage of its interactive medium. It's thoughtful, it's nuanced, and its subversive endings are a testament to the game's greatness.
It's ridiculous. Couldn't possibly be true. That's what I keep telling myself. A dead person can't write a letter. Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago. So then, why am I looking for her?